No.
G'day legends, thanks for joining us on the follow-up to the bombing at the HK airport in Afghanistan. Our guest this morning is Healey, an expert in countering violent extremism and counterterrorism. He has worked extensively in the Middle East as an intelligence analyst, and he's done experience as a private security contractor over there. Now, he's worked with special operations, is where the base of his experience comes from. Shane, mate, can you take us through? So we already spoke last week. This is the follow-up. Mate, did you get your analysis right?
I'm going to pat myself on the back and say pretty much. So we spoke about who ISK, so the Islamic State and the Khorasan was, and what their objective was, and then we saw them launch those attacks to keep creating that instability. We spoke about the difference in the ideology, which those attacks kind of highlighted. You know, as we discussed, the Taliban just wanted the US out, and they continued to support those efforts, which is what ISK were trying to stop. One thing that wasn't reported in the news, you know, they reported, as they should have heavily, the 13 US service personnel that died. They didn't report that the Taliban lost some soldiers or some fighters in those attacks too, because as we discussed with Western media, that wasn't part of the narrative. They don't want to put the Taliban. Well, most of the media didn't want to put the Taliban and the Americans on the same side. But as I said a couple of times, an enemy of my enemy is my friend, and so we saw that play out. As I said, they just wanted to get the US out, and that's effectively what's happened. And then you saw the images of, the last flight out, and then the Taliban being all celebratory. They paraded their cabinet out again and did a press conference in Kabul, which we kind of said that they were going to do to start a government. And they're trying to start international dialogue. The US have withdrawn back to Qatar, and they're now in what you'd have to say is political dialogue with the Taliban. They want, President Biden said he's going to continue to facilitate humanitarian aid into Afghanistan and Kandahar, or into Kabul. The only way he can do that is if the Taliban let him. He said he's going to facilitate Hamid Karzai International Airport's reopen to civilian flights. We'll touch on why that's important a little bit later and how they're going to do that, but I'd give myself a pass on what we discussed and what played out.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are the Taliban doing now? What are their next moves? And I guess, all of those stakeholders in Afghanistan, and I know there's quite a number of them, but the big key players, what are they doing now that the US has left? So
they're consolidating power. Now the US have gone, and there's the hysteria of "take me with you" is essentially going to start dying down. The concentration of local citizens in Kabul is dissipating. They're getting out of Kabul because if you remember last week we spoke about the next phase is the refugee crisis, where they're going to try to get to countries through non-legal means, i.e. boat people or sneak into borders. You're starting to see that there's to quote an American term, human caravans heading towards Pakistan, heading towards Iran. They're going to try to get into India. They're obviously not going to try to get into China, or they'll join the Uyghurs, but they're getting out of Kabul now, and they're trying to get back to their areas away from the Taliban because for what they know, the Americans have gone, they've shut up shop, so there's no point being in Kandahar where the Taliban have organised their forces. So then you've got, like I said, they're trying to put a legitimate government persona on. And I guess I'll touch on that a little bit more. But then you've got Al-Qaeda's starting to make their presence felt. ISK is there. They've got cells within Kabul, and there's been clashes between the Taliban and ISK, as in gun battles, on the fringes of Kabul and in some other centres. And that's what why, we spoke about it, why they want the world's media out of there. And if you look at the media reporting, and I was just checking again in the last 24 hours in America, all they're focused on is President Biden now and the failed mission, not what's now going on in Kabul, which is exactly what we said the Taliban wanted. They wanted to get the eyes of the world away and move on so they can now stage manage what the world sees.
So who is going to win? ISK, the Taliban, Al Qaeda.
What's the win?
Power struggle that is.
What's the win?
Well, who's going to take government? Who's
Taliban.
going to reform government?
The Taliban.
Yep.
Yeah, 100%. So they'll have a government. Mullah Barada and they're talking about being an inclusive government. The problem is either the previous ministers or the Prime Minister, like Ghani, have left, fled, or they're in exile. The US helped get some of the female ministers in exile. Part of that is to see if they can't operate with the Taliban, they might try to set up a government in exile, like you kind of saw in World War II with, they had the Vichy French and the French and whatever. So they're keeping that option open. They'll roll out some of the female ministers at the UN and say, I'm still talking to my constituents in this province and this is what's going on. They won't do that up front because the US genuinely is hoping that they can work with in some shape or form, work with the Taliban at some level to keep regional stability, because the last thing they want is obviously China working with them because of the $1 trillion of natural resources in Afghanistan.
Do you mind if I jump in on that point? Just to go slightly off script, I always try and link these conversations and the information back to what we're feeling in the veteran mental health kind of space and community. There has been a few posts over the last couple of days sharing the press conference in the US where they released the numbers of assets that the Americans had left behind that are most likely now in the hands of the Taliban. So first question on that, do you have any information on I'm assuming the accuracy of those numbers is fairly close to correct, given that it was a press conference. Is there any information to confirm that they are all now in the hands of the Taliban, or were they left for the Afghan army who have now handed them over?
So I was going to get to that, and that's an excellent point. There was, and I've got the photos I can give you guys to put on your website, but there was a couple of media reports last night, and you had a US, I think it was a New York Times journalist in an aircraft hangar with some Taliban fighters, and there were some Chinooks in there. Did you guys see that? Well, if you notice, the Chinooks have been gutted of all their MEIs, But did you see the way the Taliban, what they were wearing and how they were carrying their weapons? Finger outside the trigger guard. So literally, who they were ANA fighters that stayed and pledged their allegiance to the Taliban. So when they say Taliban fighters have taken over, and I said this the other week, all they've done is realign their allegiance. But you look at, that would have been their personal M4 that they were using with the partnering force 3-4 weeks ago. They had NVGs on their mounted helmets. They had their body rig. It's not like they went into an armory. Now, that's obviously happened. But if you go and look at images of a Talib sitting on the back of a technical with a PKM, his fucking fingers on the trigger, as former infantry guys, you can tell when a guy's used a weapon and been trained on a weapon system and when a guy hasn't. And if you look at some of the scenes we're seeing now, you go, that guy's been trained by a Western force. So yes, they've got their hands on all this, American kit, but a lot of it, they were part of the ANA and just stayed and turned, which we discussed.
So a quick follow on, and I don't want to ask you for a 5-year prediction because that might be a bit much, but if what you've said, Taliban is posturing to be less aggressive, they want to be a respected government. Is that something that we need to, in the West, accept? Like at the end of World War II? So I mean, just to bring it back to like World War II, Japan was an enemy at the time. Germany was an enemy. We no longer, our children no longer would consider Japan or Germany an enemy. Do we need to start preparing ourselves for the slow transition that the Taliban will one day be a respected government of Afghanistan? And if the answer is yes, then of course they're eventually going to have an up-armored military kind of asset list.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Because, so, like I said before, they've got trillions of dollars worth of natural resources that the West want. The greatest thing that happened to the Taliban, and we discussed this the other week, is having Al Qaeda and having ISK in there. They're going to not look as bad as what the others are. So while everyone's writing, the life of women is going to be so much harsher under the Taliban, I'm not disagreeing with a lot of that, but they're going to be the better option than if ISK took over a region or Al Qaeda took over a region, which is where, and I'll get into it in a sec, what the next US phase is. But if you look at even Vietnam, when we pulled out of Saigon and the North Vietnamese Communist Party took over, Vietnam's a massive holiday destination now. Now, why the human atrocities are a bit different, but they weren't. If you really do your history and you read about the North Vietnamese army and especially the Viet Cong murdering villagers that were working with the US, time is a great healer of actual history. And we've got our head up our ass thinking how great the end of the Vietnam War was. But if you actually read and look and, get on YouTube and look at some of the documentaries, it was a shithole for 5, 6, 10 years post the US withdrawal until capitalism struck. And look at Russia. Capitalism struck. China. Capitalism struck. People want money. The same thing will happen in Afghanistan. They will want money. And they'll want negotiations, and they'll want Saudi Arabia. Their human rights track record is atrocious, but everyone does business with them. China, in jail, the whole Uyghur minority, people still do business with China. It's just that everyone's pointing their finger at the US for the way the Afghans fell. That shock will go, and Syria. We spoke about Assad gassing his people. People are still talking to Assad, and he's got an economy, and he's still ruling Syria, and a lot of people will jump up and down and call bullshit on that. But I guarantee, 5 years' time, Western countries are doing business deals because Pakistan will, China will, and India will, Iran will, and the West will go, we need to get in there, otherwise they're going to take all those natural resources and we won't have them.
So what are the natural resources for Afghanistan?
I knew you were going to ask that.
What's the big one?
It's minerals, and I'm going to get it wrong, but one of them is a really rare commodity that's used in computers and stuff.
Lithium. I know lithium was a target for batteries. Yeah.
Yeah. So and Afghans being Afghans, they don't know what it is, but the West does, and so does China. There's a story today in CNN where some metal or some part for computers is a massive commodity because we're running out of it, and the Chinese have been hoarding it. This is what's going to happen, but it's a good thing because that's what capitalism, and this is how we've negotiated to not be in massive wars since World War II because of greed, and that's what saved the Cold War.
Mate, this is going to be interesting. We'll see. So I guess the rhetoric coming out now is we went to Afghan for the minerals. Now we went to Iraq for the oil. We'll see how we go.
Well, that's exactly right. That'll be. I guarantee by the end of the year you'll see that being written in the States.
You heard it here first, people. And just going back to that point about the equipment that the Afghans currently have now, and the Taliban, I'm not particularly worried. Yeah, they can use a bang stick, that's cool. But Apache attack helicopters and fast air, it's going to fall out of the sky. Having the equipment's one thing, being able to maintain it
100%.
is a completely different ballgame.
There's already that video they're trying to fly Black Hawk, was it? And it didn't work well. But the key is that the US ripped out their radar, their the thing is we've lost the night. That's the big deal for the West, and I've got a really good article written by US SOCOM about we've lost the night, because they've got NVGs now. They've got aim points. They've got, Trigicons. They've got the same technology. And we taught them how to zero weapons. We taught them roomfall clearances. Now, can they teach that? Who knows? But it means that we're going to have to reevaluate our how we operate against an enemy that kind of know our TTPs.
Which I think there's a positive. Looking for a silver lining. I mean, I don't like the risk to human life with diggers on the ground when the enemy does have night vision. But same as everything through history, in order for the West to maintain military dominance, we innovate above our enemy's capabilities. So this is just the next challenge. I see it as we now have enemy that can fight at night. So we need to innovate to the point where we can dominate without putting ourselves at risk at night. And what that means, I don't know. Fingers crossed, Robocop on the ground, but who knows? Who knows? Innovation, I think, will take place now if our enemies are up armed.
You know what it is? Use torches. Let's black them out.
Right, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Serious. They're all got their NVGs on. Just turn the torch on. Black them out. Every scout will have a big, massive, 1,000,000-watt candle torch on him.
Mate, we'll go back to mortar illumination.
100%. And that sounds funny, but that's probably one of the best things you could do pre-banging in on a compound. If they're literally concerned that they've got night vision capability, why not?
So what is going on for our audience? So for all the Australian veterans and for the Australia, we operated in Uruzgan.
Yep.
What do you have? What's going on there? And what is there any relevance to the broader picture?
Very, very much. So I'm not sure if we've already spoke. Well, we did speak about it really briefly last time. Mullah Barada, who is essentially the Taliban 2IC and the head of the Taliban government, he's from Uruzgan. So it's actually quite permissive and safe for those that are there, because those that are there are Taliban sympathisers or supporters. Mullah Ghaffar, who was Objective Dagger, he's the village chief elder for Darafshan. Always was, always is. Chora Baluchi is back under Taliban control. So, the US ODA and JSOC kept operations going in Uruzgan after we left. I spoke about Abdul Hai on the podcast. They killed him in 2016 in a drone strike. So they kept degrading the Uruzgan insurgency, but so far, and I was speaking to someone in there yesterday for this podcast, and they were saying it's essentially gone back to where it was 99, 2000. You're still there because you're part of them. It's a Pashtun kind of area. And they, even when we were there, they killed MK. They were starting to take out his blokes. So the ground was being set in 2011, 12, 13. Once Prime Minister Gillard announced the withdrawal, they started taking out. They forgot about us and went after the Afghan politicians. And MK was the chief of police, and they car bombed him in Kabul. They went after Mido Khan. They went after Haji Wali Jan. They got rid of his power base because we're back. But life for a lot of the people in the villages that we would have patrolled through is no different to what it was when we were there and prior to us being there.
So, speaking about politicians and how this is all tying in with government, can we start talking? Can we explain a little bit of the avenues that a government has or the US has to execute particular missions or campaigns? We talk about.
All right. Yeah. So nice segue. I'm not sure if people realise, but under US constitutional law, they've got several options or what titles that govern their military operations. So first is diplomacy, as we discussed, politicians going to the UN and trying to get a resolution. When that doesn't work, they have to go to Congress for an act of war, which is done under Title 10. Now, I'm going to be very, very general. So for anyone out there who's scholars that say, oh, what about part this and whatever, I'm being very broad for the audience. But it's under Title 10. And that basically is when the president will go to Congress and say, I want Congress to authorise appropriations because I want to send through the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the US military into Afghanistan. Conventional kind of military options, right? Then there's the third option, which is, okay, we don't want to send 10,000, 20,000 troops back into Afghanistan or back into Iraq, but they've got some dudes that we want to get off the battle space. So it's called the third option, which is Title 50. And Title 50 governs essentially the CIA and paramilitary operations. So, for example, the Osama bin Laden raid was done under Title 50, not under Title 10. So you would have heard the term National Mission Unit or Special Mission Unit. That's what it is. It's a presidential tasking that hasn't gone through Congress. And it's a legal tasking. They've got, it's got to go through the US law, but the president will enact Title 50 and do it covertly rather than Title 10 and go through Congress. So this is where the rhetoric, where Joe Biden and the US media go, there goes the last US plane, or the US military is now out of Afghanistan. What that means is Title 50 has ended in Afghanistan. Title 50 still kicks on. So they've still got a counter-terrorism mission inside, not just Afghanistan, Iraq, anywhere globally where there is a threat to the US or coalition national security. So when you hear about taking someone out in Yemen, hostage rescues, when you hear, Special Mission Unit, one of the 3 US Tier 1 units conducting an operation, that is usually done under Title 50.
So just to clarify, I think there's a slip of the tongue there. You're saying that when the last plane leaves, Title 10 finishes, yep. Title 50 doesn't. Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah, yep. And it's a legal process. It's essentially the US's internal JPEL list. They've got a whole lobby of lawyers in the White House. It's a legal process. It's essentially a warrant gets signed. Who is this guy? Is he good or bad? And this is even every time they do a drone strike anywhere. Like when they went after the Khorasan group or any non, and I'll say conventional military, but that's wrapping SOCOM up in it too. Non-conventional military action is done under Title 50. And that's what, remember last time I spoke about there'll be meetings going on behind the scenes to keep the US active? The CIA director met with Mullah Baradar in Kabul to discuss this. So William Burns, who's a CIA director, had secret meetings in Kabul with the Taliban, Mullah Baradar and the other military commanders to discuss this exact thing. We will still have a presence in your country in some form, and we will have the ability through, drones and other means to target you if we require. But that also means extraction. So you might have guys and girls on the ground in an unofficial capacity now, still rounding up US citizens and getting them to Jalalabad airfield that there's no one at, that the US can land a plane at 2 a.m. and get them out with no media, and that's what phase we're in now. There's going to be no journalist, and there will be traces on the internet. And if you want to, everyone start Googling this, or a good one if you want to understand it. Google, if you watch Joe Rogan, the Joe Rogan podcast, Google Annie Jacobson, and she wrote a book called Kill Vanish. Kill something Vanish. And it's one of the thickest books I've ever read in my life. It's massive. But she talks about everything from the MACV-SOG operations, which the Australian Army was involved in Vietnam, right through to today. Kill, surprise, vanish.
Have to get that.
And that was the code, that was the motto for the US OSS, which is the precursor to the CIA, that used to parachute into France to work with the French resistance to kill Nazis. So they've been doing it since World War II. The guys that were going into Berlin and behind the Iron Curtain to spy and take on Russia.
So, we're talking, that was to the American side of all these sort of operations and units. Australia, I'm assuming, has the same sort of system, right?
Not to that effect. We don't have a declared title or law in our constitution that allows the the Governor, another misconception, the Governor General to authorise a clandestine and covert action against an adversary, but there are some provisions within the Australian Constitution and national counter-terrorism guidelines that, if required, could take place. So, and I'll give you an example of something that I was a part of, a few things, but Operation Okra. I was part of the first tap on that. Now, the Air Force got tapped to go as the lead element. When Prime Minister Abbott said we'll support the US in the counter-Islamic State space. When he put them forward, he put an advance party from SOCOM forward at the same time as a insurance policy in case a NEO had to be activated to get the Australian Embassy out of Baghdad. Now, again, it was at Al Minhad Air Base, wasn't going into Iraq, was no declaration of war. But the joke was by the commander of 633, because if you remember, Prime Minister Abbott came out and said there'll be no Australian boots on Iraq at that point. So we were in a meeting and the General goes, "Thank God you guys wear Merrills." and I probably wouldn't have been able to talk about this 2 years ago, but if you read the book Mosul, by Benny McKeldra, it talks about bits and pieces in there. But we don't have a title, getting back to your question, we don't have a Title 50, but there are some provisions for NEOs that, the Prime Minister and Special Operations Command can move soldiers into pre-positions if they need to recover Australian embassies or Australian personnel, hostages or whatever. In 2005, when what was that dickhead's name in Iraq? Got captured. They pre-positioned some guys forward in case they were going to conduct a hostage recovery operation. Yeah.
Oh, there you go, mate. Thanks for that. So, what's going to happen now in this space in the future? And have you got any more predictions that we can hold you to? What is going to happen? How do you see it sort of unfolding?
So one of the next things that will happen is the Taliban will start doing a lot of media conferences as a government. You'll see them at that desk. They'll all be out there and they'll be really trying to sell their message. One of the messages that they'll be selling is, and they're already starting to talk about it, and if you Google it, we haven't completed our training of our forces on the ground yet. And what that's giving them is, if media gets out of, Taliban soldiers hurting women or hurting kids or whatever, they can say, well, we didn't order that and they need to be retrained. So and they're already starting to do it. When they're getting questions, how are you going to treat women? We've got a women policy. We've just got to get it out to our guys on the ground. So they're going to start running a bit of a media campaign. They'll look to get rid of any dissident media agencies or journalists. They'll only want journalists from any country that's selling their message, which will be we're here, we're a legitimate government, we're doing the right thing. You know, the line I like at the moment, we're going to allow women to go to school and to get education and to work, but it'll be under Sharia conditions. So you will see that. You'll see a ramp up of Al-Qaeda and ISK attacks, for sure, because they're trying to stay relevant in a space that they only get funding if they're conducting operations. And you're seeing the Northern Alliance, well, what was the Northern Alliance, in some of the regional areas, fighting back against Taliban rule. So by no means is Afghanistan a stable state. It's very much in both political chaos and in some areas because of the tribal, you know, the Hazarans do not want the Pashtun Taliban in their areas. So take the word Taliban out, it's literally Hazarans versus Pashtuns, which has been going on since Moses was a child. So you'll see that play out. The Americans at a political level have already said they're going to continue posturing out of Qatar and processing the 100 and something thousand refugees. Like, think of the task of that, vetting and processing, and they've just had a massive cyclone and wipe out a couple of states in America. Where are they going to put 100,000 refugees? The West and the UN will start, you know, the World Health Organization and some of the UN agencies will start looking at humanitarian crisis. You know, they'll try to get in there to get food on the ground, to get water, to get the Red Crescent will go in there to give some reports. So to get you up to date information, that's who I look at, the Red Crescent, as the Muslim or the Islamic version of the Red Cross, and they'll let them go everywhere. So that's what you'll see probably in the next, 3 to 6 months, is the Taliban trying to become legitimate, the West trying to shape geopolitically the Taliban leadership, and you'll see countries doing deals with them, signing pacts, signing trade agreements, signing. China's going to come in and offer to build roads for whatever. There'll be a bit of a, the analogy I used the other day was feeding frenzy, seagulls and chips. You'll see a bit of that going on. Pakistan will want to have a lot more influence around Kandahar, border closings. So, yeah, that's what's going to play out in the next 3 to 6 months. Noting that it's coming into winter, snow, cold, block roads.
Mate, so there's a prediction. What do you reckon? Shithole for the next 5 years?
No. No, because as we know, they've lived, I guess the easiest way to say it, a biblical existence comfortably for hundreds of years anyway. So they might not have some phone coverage, but you've been to those villages, they're happy anyway. So a shithole, it's not going to be Maroubra or Sydney or Bondi, but that's never been what they've had. They're going to eke out the same living and lifestyle. They're going to have their fig orchards. They're going to have their goats, their cattle, their crops, their wheat, and they're going to just try to go back to an Afghan way of life.
Nice. Well, mate, thanks very much. And everybody else that's listening, if you enjoyed Shane coming on the podcast and the news, remembering that our podcast come out on Monday, and you can go and find him on any of the platforms that you go and listen to your podcast normally. Mate, thanks for coming on again, and we'll keep having you back on.
If they've got any questions, get them to leave them in a comment box somewhere, and I guess maybe next time we can answer a few of the listeners' direct questions.
No worries, that's a good point. Cheers, mate. All right, that'll do it.
Cheers.
See you, boys.